The rain fell in relentless sheets as the hired carriage lurched to a stop before Ashbourne Manor. Lavinia Hartley clutched her worn leather bag and peered through the water-streaked window at the imposing stone facade. Gothic spires pierced the gray October sky, and not a single window glowed with welcoming light. She had seen grander estates during her 7 years as a private nurse, but none had felt quite so forbidding. The driver opened her door without ceremony, clearly eager to be rid of his passenger and return to town. Lavinia stepped down into a puddle, cold water seeping immediately through her practical boots. She gathered her cloak tighter and hurried toward the entrance, her bag growing heavier with each step. The massive oak door opened before she could knock. A severe man in immaculate butler's livery looked down his considerable nose at her, his gaze traveling from her damp bonnet to her muddied hem, with barely concealed disdain. "Miss Hartley, I presume," he said, his tone suggesting she might be something unpleasant tracked in someone's shoe. "Yes, sir. I'm here to— We are aware of why you are here." He stepped aside with visible reluctance. "I am Mr. Graves, butler of Ashbourne Manor. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, will show you to your quarters." Lavinia entered a cavernous entrance hall. Dark portraits glared from paneled walls, and the air smelled of beeswax and something else. Neglect, perhaps, or simply the absence of joy. A fire burned in the enormous hearth, but it did little to warm the space. Mr. Graves circled her slowly, inspecting her bag as if it might contain contraband. "I trust you understand your position here, Miss Hartley. You have been employed to attend to Lady Margaret. You will take your meals with the staff, keep to the servants' quarters, and maintain appropriate distance from the family." He paused, meaningfully. "His lordship values his privacy." "Of course," Lavinia said quietly, though her chest tightened with the familiar ache of being reduced to her function. "Not a person, just the nurse." A stern woman in a gray dress appeared from a side corridor. "This way," Mrs. Davies said without preamble, already turning. "Mind you don't drip on the carpets." Lavinia followed the housekeeper up a servant's staircase, their footsteps echoing in the narrow passage. Mrs. Davies delivered a stream of instructions without once looking back. Meal times, household rules, the absolute importance of not disturbing his lordship. "Lady Margaret's health has declined these past months," Mrs. Davies said as they climbed to the second floor. "She's of sound mind, though her lungs trouble her. The physician visits weekly." She paused at a door. "She's a good woman, kind when others in this house are—" The housekeeper caught herself. "You'll find her easy to tend." The door opened to reveal a spacious room that immediately contradicted everything Lavinia had seen thus far. Here, at last, was warmth. A fire crackled cheerfully. Thick curtains in rich burgundy were drawn back to reveal rain-lashed windows. Bookshelves lined one wall, and fresh flowers, late-blooming roses, sat on the bedside table. In a chair near the fire sat a slender woman with silver hair arranged in an elegant twist. Despite the blanket across her lap and the pallor of her complexion, Lady Margaret Blackwood radiated vitality. Her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence and humor. "Ah, the cavalry has arrived," Lady Margaret said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Mrs. Davies, you may stop frightening the poor girl now. I'm sure Mr. Graves has already done sufficient damage to her nerves." A smile tugged at Lavinia's lips before she could stop it. "I shall leave you to become acquainted, my lady," Mrs. Davies said, though her tone had softened slightly. She departed, closing the door with a decisive click. "Come closer, child. Let me see you properly." Lady Margaret gestured to a chair opposite hers. "And for heaven's sake, remove that damp cloak before you catch your death. Ironic, considering you're here to prevent mine." Lavinia couldn't help but laugh, as she obeyed, draping her cloak over a nearby stand. She settled into the offered chair, finding it remarkably comfortable. "Lady Margaret, You must be exhausted from your journey. Tea?" Without waiting for an answer, Lady Margaret reached for a bell. "I've been quite looking forward to your arrival. The last nurse they sent was terrified of me. spent most of her time hiding in corners and jumping at shadows. Utterly useless. I promise not to hide in corners, my lady. Margaret, please! We'll be spending considerable time together. Formality becomes tedious. She studied Lavinia with unnerving directness. You're younger than I expected. 25? 26, my lady. Margaret. And no family, according to the agency. No, ma'am. My parents passed 8 years ago. Something flickered in Margaret's eyes, recognition of a kindred loneliness. Then we are both rather adrift, aren't we? Though I suspect you navigate your solitude with more grace than my son manages his. Before Lavinia could respond, the door opened without warning. A man strode in, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair slightly disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. He wore riding clothes, and his boots bore traces of mud. Everything about him suggested coiled tension, barely restrained. This, Lavinia knew instinctively, was Arthur Blackwood, the Marquess of Ashbourne. He stopped short upon seeing her, his expression shifting from surprise to cold dismissal in an instant. Pale gray eyes swept over her without really seeing her. She was just another servant, another piece of furniture in his mother's room. "Mother, you should be resting," he said, his voice a deep baritone that might have been pleasant without its harsh edge. "I am resting, darling. I'm sitting, aren't I? Completely immobile. You know what the physician said?" "The physician says many things, most of them tedious." Margaret's tone remained light, but Lavinia detected steel beneath. "Have you met Miss Hartley? She arrived not 20 minutes ago." Arthur's gaze flicked to Lavinia, then away, as if the effort of acknowledging her was too great. "Miss Hartley, you'll find your instructions regarding my mother's care in that folder." He gestured vaguely toward a writing desk. "She requires her medication at 8 each morning and evening. Her diet is restricted, no rich foods. She's not to overtax herself with excessive activity or excitement." He delivered these instructions to the air, somewhere above Lavinia's head, never quite meeting her eyes. "I understand, my lord," Lavinia said, keeping her voice professional, despite the dismissal stinging like a slap. "See that you do." He turned to his mother, and for the briefest moment, something in his expression softened. "I'll return tomorrow to check on you." "How thrilling! I shall count the hours," Margaret said dryly. Arthur's jaw tightened. He left without another word, the door closing sharply behind him. Silence settled over the room. Lavinia tried to ignore the familiar ache of invisibility, the sensation of being nothing more than hired hands and medical knowledge. "You must forgive my son," Margaret said quietly, all trace of humor gone. "He's not always so glacial. 3 years ago, he lost his wife during childbirth, the baby as well. Since then, he's locked every warm feeling away, as if by feeling nothing, he might avoid pain." She met Lavinia's gaze. "This house has become a mausoleum, and Arthur its most dedicated mourner. Perhaps your presence will remind him that life continues, even after loss." Lavinia thought of the cold-eyed man who had just left, the way he'd looked through her rather than at her. A man surrounded by wealth and title, yet completely, utterly alone. "I'm here to care for you, Margaret," she said gently. "Yes, well, we shall see what else you might accomplish." Margaret smiled, a knowing expression that made Lavinia oddly uneasy. "Now, I believe I promised you tea, and you must tell me everything about yourself. I do so love a good story." That night, alone in her small room in the servants' quarters, Lavinia sat by a narrow window and watched rain trace patterns on the glass. The room was clean but sparse. A bed, a wardrobe, a washstand. Nothing like the comfortable warmth of Margaret's chambers. She'd experienced this before, in other grand houses. The careful separation between those who served and those who were served. The way aristocrats looked past you, as if you were merely an extension of their furniture. But something about Arthur Blackwood's cold dismissal had cut deeper than usual. Perhaps because beneath that frozen exterior, she'd glimpsed something heartbreakingly familiar. A loneliness that matched her own. "A man surrounded by everything," she whispered to the rain, and utterly alone. She would do her job well. She always did. She would care for Margaret with all the skill and compassion she possessed. And she would remain invisible to the Marquess of Ashbourne, just as he clearly preferred. It was better that way. Safer. Lavinia extinguished her candle and settled into bed, listening to the old house creak and settle around her. Tomorrow would bring routine, medication schedules, careful monitoring, the quiet work of healing. She fell asleep to the sound of rain, unaware that some healings begin without permission, and that the coldest hearts often require the most persistent warmth. 2 weeks passed, in a rhythm that Lavinia found unexpectedly pleasant, despite the household's initial coldness. Margaret proved to be exactly as advertised, sharp-witted, opinionated, and determined to extract every possible ounce of entertainment from each day. "That cannot possibly be what happens next," Margaret declared one afternoon, as Lavinia read from a Gothic novel. "The heroine is far too sensible to go into the abandoned wing at midnight. What author wrote this nonsense?" "A very successful one, apparently," Lavinia said, fighting a smile. "It's been quite popular." "Popular and good are rarely the same thing. Continue, though. I must know if she survives her own stupidity." Lavinia had just reached the part where mysterious footsteps echoed through the corridor when the door opened. Arthur entered, as he did each afternoon, at precisely 4 o'clock. Unlike that first encounter, however, he now acknowledged her presence with a slight nod before addressing his mother. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, his tone marginally warmer than during their initial meeting. "Oppressed by terrible literature and entertained by your Miss Hartley's dramatic reading voice," Margaret replied. "She does an excellent ghostly moan." Lavinia felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I was merely trying to make it more engaging, my lady." And succeeding admirably. Margaret's eyes sparkled with mischief as they shifted to her son. "You should stay and listen, Arthur. It might remind you that life contains elements beyond ledgers and estate business. I have correspondence to attend to," he said, but Lavinia noticed he didn't immediately leave. His gaze lingered on the book in her hands. "What are you reading?" "The Mysteries of Blackmore Hall," Lavinia supplied, then added with carefully neutral tones, "It's about a haunted estate and a tormented lord." Something flickered in Arthur's eyes. Humor, perhaps, or irony. How original. "I thought so," Margaret said sweetly. "Though our own tormented lord is far less interesting. He doesn't even have the decency to pace battlements at midnight." "Mother, I'm merely stating facts, darling." Arthur's jaw tightened, but Lavinia could have sworn she saw the ghost of a smile. He turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Hartley, I notice my mother's color has improved since your arrival. Whatever you're doing, continue." It was the first compliment he'd paid her. Lavinia's foolish heart gave an inappropriate flutter. "Thank you, my lord." He left, and Margaret immediately laughed. "Well, whatever you're doing, continue." How effusive. Next, he'll be writing poetry about your medical competence. "Margaret, please," Lavinia said, but she couldn't quite suppress her smile. The older woman's expression softened. "He's noticing you, child. Slowly, yes, and he fights it terribly. But he's beginning to see you as a person rather than simply the nurse. That's progress." Lavinia tried to ignore the dangerous warmth those words created. She was here to work, nothing more. Men like Arthur Blackwood didn't truly see women like her, and even if they did, nothing could come of it. The real shift happened 3 nights later. Lavinia woke to urgent knocking at her door. She grabbed her robe and rushed into the corridor to find a young maid, wide-eyed with panic. "It's Lady Margaret, miss. She can't breathe proper." Lavinia ran, her heart pounding. She burst into Margaret's chamber to find the older woman sitting upright in bed, her face pale, lips tinged with blue as she struggled for air. The sound of her labored breathing filled the room. "It's all right," Lavinia said, her voice calm despite her racing pulse. "I'm here. Try to slow your breathing. I know it's difficult, but I need you to trust me." She moved quickly, propping Margaret up with additional pillows, checking her pulse, listening to the rasp of her lungs. The maid hovered uselessly near the door, Fetch his lordship, Lavinia ordered. Then bring hot water and towels, quickly. As the maid fled, Lavinia pulled her medical bag close and began preparing a steam treatment. She spoke continuously in low, soothing tones, one hand on Margaret's wrist, monitoring the rapid pulse, the other working to measure the proper dose of medicine. You're going to be fine. This will pass. Keep your eyes on me, Margaret. Good. Just like that. You're doing beautifully. The door crashed open. Arthur appeared in the doorway, wild-eyed, wearing only shirt sleeves and trousers hastily pulled on. His hair stood in disarray, and stark fear transformed his usually controlled features. Mother? Stay back. My lord, Lavinia said firmly, not looking away from Margaret. You'll only increase her distress. Trust me to manage this. For a moment, she thought he might argue. Instead, he froze in the doorway, hands clenched at his sides, watching as Lavinia worked with swift competence. She had Margaret breathing the medicated steam, administered the proper dose of cardiac tonic, and monitored every change in color and respiration. Her hands remained steady, even as her mind calculated risks and possibilities. She'd seen this before, the sudden crisis, the narrow window to intervene. That's it, she murmured, stroking Margaret's hand. You're not alone, darling. I'm right here. Feel the steam helping? Your lungs are opening. Each breath a little easier than the last. From his position by the door, Arthur watched, transfixed. This woman, whom he'd barely acknowledged as human for 2 weeks, had transformed into something extraordinary. Her fear was visible in the tension of her shoulders, yet her voice remained steady, her touch gentle. She wasn't just performing medical duties. She genuinely cared. The realization hit him with unexpected force. Gradually, color returned to Margaret's face. Her breathing, while still labored, grew less desperate. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, the crisis passed. Margaret lay back against the pillows, exhausted, but clearly improving. Sleep now, Lavinia whispered, tucking the blankets around her patient. I'll stay right here. You're safe. Margaret's eyes fluttered closed, and within minutes, her breathing settled into the even rhythm of sleep. Only then did Lavinia allow herself to sag slightly, releasing a shaking breath. She pressed one hand to her chest, trying to slow her own racing heart. Miss Hartley. Arthur's voice made her jump. She'd almost forgotten he was there. She rose quickly, smoothing her robe, suddenly acutely aware that she wore only her nightgown beneath it, her hair hanging loose down her back. My lord, she should be fine now. The crisis has passed. But I'll remain with her through the night to ensure... You saved her life. His voice was rough, stripped of its usual icy control. I did my job, sir. No. He stepped closer, his gray eyes intense in the firelight. You did far more than that. The way you spoke to her, the way you... He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. You care for her. Truly care, not merely as a patient, but as a person. Lavinia met his gaze, and for the first time she didn't feel invisible. He was truly seeing her, Lavinia, not just the nurse. She's easy to care for, my lord, she said softly. She's a remarkable woman. Something shifted in Arthur's expression, a crack in the frozen mask he'd worn for so long. Thank you, he said quietly. From the depth of my heart, thank you. They stood there in the firelit silence, awareness crackling between them like a living thing. Arthur seemed to realize simultaneously that she stood before him in her nightclothes, her dark hair tumbling over her shoulders, her brown eyes huge in her pale face. He stepped back abruptly. I should let you rest, or rather, continue your vigil. He moved toward the door, then paused. If you need anything at all, send for me immediately. Of course, my lord. After he left, Lavinia sank back into her chair beside Margaret's bed, her legs suddenly weak. She tried to tell herself the trembling was merely aftermath of the crisis, exhaustion and relief. But she knew better. Something had changed in that charged moment, something dangerous and impossible and entirely beyond her control. The following morning, Arthur appeared in the library where Lavinia had gone to select a new book. For Margaret, he'd clearly been waiting for her. "Miss Hartley." He approached, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "I wanted to inquire about my mother's condition this morning. She's much improved, my lord. Ate breakfast, complained about the blandness of the porridge, and demanded I find her something with actual literary merit to read." Lavinia allowed herself a small smile. "I would say she's quite recovered." "Thanks to you." He paused, seeming to wrestle with himself. "I realize I've been unwelcoming since your arrival. That was inexcusable. You were protective of your mother. That's understandable. It was more than that." He moved to the window, staring out at the autumn landscape. "I've spent 3 years keeping everyone at arm's length. It seemed safer that way." The raw honesty in his voice made Lavinia's chest ache. "After loss, we protect ourselves however we can, my lord." He turned to face her. "You've experienced loss yourself. My parents, when I was 19, a fever took them both within days of each other. The old pain flickered, duller now, but never quite absent. I understand how the world can feel. Precarious, afterward. How difficult it becomes to trust in anything lasting." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Lavinia saw the grief he carried, the loneliness he'd wrapped around himself like armor, and she suspected he saw similar wounds in her. "How long have you been a nurse?" he asked. 7 years. I trained at a hospital in London, then took private positions." She tilted her head slightly. "Your mother mentioned you have strong opinions about Gothic novels?" The corner of his mouth quirked. Not quite a smile, but close. "I find them melodramatic." Margaret finds them entertaining, which I would argue is their primary purpose. She finds everything entertaining. Last week she convinced me to read her a scientific article about volcanic activity because she claimed it was more exciting than the society pages. And was it? This time he did smile, and the transformation was remarkable. For just a moment, the frozen grief melted away, revealing the man beneath. Considerably. A comfortable silence fell between them. Lavinia knew she should leave, return to her patient, maintain the proper distance between servant and master. But she found herself reluctant to break this fragile connection. "Margaret speaks highly of you," Arthur said quietly. "She says you don't treat her as fragile or diminished, that you talk to her as an equal." "She is my equal. More than, really." Lavinia met his eyes steadily. Her illness doesn't diminish who she is. It's merely something she's managing. Most people forget that. They see the illness, and nothing else. "Yes," Lavinia agreed softly. "I imagine it's rather like being seen only as the Marquess, rather than Arthur Blackwood, the man who misses his mother's laughter and reads articles about volcanoes." His eyes widened slightly at her. Boldness. Then, slowly, he smiled again. "You're rather perceptive, Miss Hartley. It's the nurse's curse, my lord. We tend to notice things others miss." Over the following days, Arthur began appearing with increasing frequency during Lavinia's reading sessions with Margaret. He would settle into a chair, ostensibly to visit his mother, but his attention often drifted to Lavinia, the expressions that crossed her face as she read, the way she gesticulated slightly during exciting passages, her spontaneous laughter at absurd plot developments. Margaret, naturally, noticed everything. "You could simply admit you enjoy her company," she told her son one afternoon when Lavinia had stepped out. "All this pretending to visit me is rather transparent." "I am visiting you," Arthur protested. "Darling, you visit me. Then you spend the entire time watching her, as if she's some fascinating puzzle you're desperate to solve." "Mother? She's remarkable, isn't she? Intelligent, compassionate, and wonderfully unimpressed by titles and wealth." Margaret's expression turned serious. "But she's also vulnerable, Arthur. She has no family, no protection. If you're merely amusing yourself, I would never—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what I'm doing. I only know that when she's in the room, everything feels lighter, as if I can breathe properly for the first time in 3 years." Margaret reached over and patted his hand. "Then perhaps you should tell her that, though I warn you, Constance is arriving tomorrow for her promised visit, and she won't take kindly to potential competition. Arthur groaned. He'd forgotten about his cousin's planned stay. Lady Constance Pembroke arrived the next day in a flurry of expensive perfume and fashionable silk. Beautiful in a sharp-featured way, she swept into Ashbourne Manor as if she already owned it, which, Margaret informed Lavinia dryly, was precisely Constance's ambition. "She's been pursuing Arthur for 2 years," Margaret explained as they watched from her window while Constance directed servants about her excessive luggage. "Convinced herself she's destined to be the next Marchioness. Arthur tolerates her because she's family, but he's never shown the slightest romantic interest." "It's none of my concern, my lady." "Oh, but I rather think it is." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Particularly when you go quite pink every time my son enters the room." "Margaret, I may be ill, child, but I'm not blind." That evening, to Lavinia's horror, Margaret insisted she join the family for dinner. "You are my companion," Margaret declared, when Lavinia protested. "Where I dine, you dine." "My lady, it's not appropriate." "Nonsense. Besides, I require assistance with my meal. Medical reasons." Margaret's expression was pure innocence. So Lavinia found herself seated at the formal dining table, acutely aware of her simple dress compared to Constance's elaborate gown. Arthur sat at the head of the table, Margaret on his right, Constance on his left, and Lavinia beside Margaret. Constance's gaze swept over Lavinia with dismissive assessment. "Miss Hartley, how quaint." "Margaret, I didn't realize you required a nurse at meals." "Lavinia keeps me company," Margaret said smoothly. "The conversation is far superior to staring at Arthur's brooding face alone." "I don't brood," Arthur said. "Darling, you're brooding right now." Despite her discomfort, Lavinia had to suppress a smile. Constance noticed, and leaned forward with predatory interest. "Tell me, Miss Hartley, how long have you been a nurse? It must be such rewarding work, caring for the infirm." The condescension dripped from every word. Lavinia kept her expression neutral. 7 years, Lady Pembroke. I find it fulfilling. How admirable. Such dedication to service." Constance smiled sweetly. "I confess I could never do such work, all those unpleasant tasks, the constant attendance on others' needs. But then, some people are simply born to serve, aren't they?" Lavinia felt the barb strike home. She saw Arthur's jaw tighten, noticed Margaret's eyes flash with anger. "Indeed," Lavinia said quietly, "just as some people are born to be kind and others are not." Constance's smile froze. Arthur made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. The rest of the dinner passed in tense civility. Constance monopolized the conversation, discussing London society, recent engagements, who was marrying whom. She directed most of her comments to Arthur, touching his arm frequently, laughing at things that weren't particularly amusing. Lavinia focused on her plate, feeling increasingly out of place. This was Arthur's world. Elegant dinners, sophisticated conversation, women in silk gowns who knew exactly which fork to use. She was a nurse from nowhere, with no family, no connections, no place at this table. As dessert was served, Constance reached for her wineglass. Her hand seemed to slip, and the deep red liquid cascaded directly onto Lavinia's lap. "Oh!" Constance gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "How clumsy of me! I'm terribly sorry, Miss Hartley. These things happen, don't they? Though I suppose that dress wasn't particularly valuable anyway." Lavinia stood slowly, wine dripping down her skirt, humiliation burning in her chest. Everyone at the table stared, servants frozen in the doorway, Margaret with barely suppressed fury, Arthur with dark anger in his eyes. "Please excuse me," Lavinia said, proud that her voice remained steady. She set down her napkin with deliberate care and walked from the room, spine straight, refusing to hurry despite the mortification scorching through her. Behind her, she heard Arthur's voice, cold with rage. "That was unforgivable, Constance." "It was an accident, Arthur. Don't be melodramatic." "It was deliberate cruelty. I won't tolerate." But Lavinia was already up the stairs, fleeing to her small room, the door closing behind her with a quiet click that somehow felt final. She stood in the middle of her chamber, staring down at the ruined dress, her best dress, though Constance was right that it was nothing compared to the fine gowns worn by women of her class. Tears burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was what she'd tried to remember. She was the nurse, the servant, invisible and easily dismissed. Whatever fragile connection she'd imagined forming with Arthur was precisely that, imagined. He was a Marquess. She was nobody. A knock sounded at her door. "Miss Hartley?" Arthur's voice. Lavinia's heart lurched. "I'm quite all right, my lord. Please, return to your dinner." Lavinia? The use of her Christian name shocked her. "Please, let me in." She shouldn't. It was improper, potentially dangerous to her employment. But she found herself opening the door anyway. Arthur stood in the corridor, still in his dinner clothes, his expression tortured. "I came to apologize for my cousin's abhorrent behavior. It's not your fault, my lord, isn't it?" He stepped closer, and she realized she should retreat, should maintain proper distance. But she was frozen. "I've watched Constance belittle you all evening. I should have stopped it sooner. I should have—" He broke off, seeming to struggle with words. "Are you truly all right?" "I'm accustomed to being invisible, my lord," she said, unable to keep the pain from her voice. "To being dismissed as merely the help. It's nothing new." "You are not invisible to me." The words hung between them, charged with dangerous meaning. Lavinia looked up at him, at his gray eyes burning with intensity, and saw the truth there. He saw her, not the nurse, not the servant. Her, Lavinia. "My lord, this is... we can't..." She tried to find words for the impossibility between them. "I know." His voice was rough. "Believe me, I know. But I find myself unable to..." He reached out, his hand hovering near her face as if he wanted to touch her, but didn't dare. "When you're in a room, everything else fades. When you laugh, I feel something I thought long dead. And when I watched that insufferable woman hurt you tonight, I wanted to..." He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize how close they stood, how improper this all was. Footsteps echoed in the corridor below, a maid passing perhaps, or Mr. Graves on his rounds. Arthur stepped back as if burned. "Forgive me, this is entirely inappropriate. I should not have come here." "No," Lavinia whispered, though whether she agreed or protested, she wasn't certain. He looked at her for one more moment, longing and conflict warring in his expression. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Lavinia closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding so hard she felt certain it would bruise her ribs. She pressed shaking fingers to her lips. This was dangerous. This was impossible. This would end in heartbreak. But oh, the traitorous hope that bloomed in her chest refused to be silenced. Over the following 3 days, Arthur became even more attentive during his visits to Margaret's room, but there was a new tension in his manner, as if he was fighting something internal, some battle Lavinia couldn't quite interpret. Constance remained at the manor, her presence like a storm cloud, making pointed comments about appropriate matches and maintaining standards. Lavinia kept to her duties, professional and distant, trying desperately to protect her heart from the inevitable pain. Then Margaret confronted her. "You're a coward," the older woman said one morning, setting down her teacup with deliberate force. Lavinia looked up from measuring medication, startled. "I beg your pardon?" "My son is falling in love with you, and you're pretending not to notice. That makes you a coward." "Margaret, please. Even if that were true, which it isn't, nothing could come of it. I'm a nurse. He's a Marquess. The very idea is absurd." "Is it? Or is it merely inconvenient to societal expectations?" Margaret leaned forward intensely. "I watched my son die inside after Catherine. I watched him close off every feeling, every possibility of joy. Then you arrived, and for the first time in 3 years, I've seen him truly alive. Don't tell me that's absurd." "But society is composed of small-minded people Terrified of their own mediocrity, Margaret said fiercely. My son has wealth, title, and power. If he chooses to marry a woman of character and compassion rather than an empty-headed aristocrat, society will eventually accept it because society always bows to power. She softened slightly. The only question is whether you care for him. Lavinia's hands trembled as she set down the medicine bottle. It doesn't matter what I feel. He would be ruined socially, and I would be blamed for it. The grasping nurse who seduced the Marquess. That's how the story would be told. Only if you let fear write the ending. Before Lavinia could respond, raised voices echoed from downstairs. Both women turned toward the sound. That's Arthur, Margaret said, and he sounds furious. They heard rapid footsteps on the stairs. Then Arthur appeared in the doorway, his face dark with anger, and something else, resolution. Pack your belongings, Miss Hartley, he said without preamble. The words struck like a physical blow. Lavinia felt the blood drain from her face. My lord, I'm sending you away. Today. I've arranged for a carriage to take you back to London. His voice was harsh, but she saw the muscle jumping in his jaw, the way his hands clenched at his sides. Arthur, what is this? Margaret demanded. This is me remembering my responsibilities, my position. Miss Hartley's continued presence here is inappropriate. Lavinia understood then. Constance had won. Whatever battle had been raging, social pressure had prevailed. Of course it had. She'd been foolish to imagine anything else. I understand, my lord, she said, proud that her voice didn't shake. I'll be ready within the hour. Lavinia, Margaret began. It's all right. Lavinia touched the older woman's hand gently. You're so much improved now. You'll be fine without me. She left the room before either of them could see the tears threatening to spill. In her small chamber, Lavinia moved mechanically, folding her few possessions into her worn bag. Her hands shook as she smoothed her spare dress, the one that wasn't wine-stained. She'd known this would happen. She'd known from the beginning that there was no place for her here. Not really. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. A soft knock came at her door. Margaret entered without waiting for permission, moving with surprising vigor despite her illness. That stubborn, idiotic son of mine, she said without preamble. Do you know what he told me just now? That he's sending you away to protect your reputation. As if dismissing you suddenly won't cause exactly the gossip he claims to fear. Margaret, please! He's terrified, Lavinia, terrified of losing someone again, terrified of breaking social rules, terrified of his own feelings. So he's choosing the coward's path, pushing away the first person who's made him feel alive in 3 years. Margaret gripped Lavinia's hands. But you don't have to accept it. You could fight for him. How? Lavinia's voice broke. I have no power here, no voice. You're the woman he loves, whether he's brave enough to admit it or not. Margaret's eyes shone with fierce determination, and sometimes, child, love requires us to be braver than we ever imagined. Before Lavinia could respond, they heard a commotion downstairs, Constance's sharp voice, Mr. Graves's formal tones, and then Arthur's, raised in anger. What now? Margaret muttered, moving toward the door. Lavinia followed, her heart pounding. They reached the top of the main staircase just as Arthur's voice echoed through the entrance hall. I don't care what you think is appropriate, Constance. This is my home, and I'll make my own decisions. Your decisions? Constance's laugh was brittle. You're making yourself a laughingstock, mooning over a common nurse while suitable matches surround you. She's manipulated you, Arthur. Can't you see? Women like her, they latch on to wealthy men, use whatever means necessary. Enough! Arthur's roar silenced her. You will not speak of her that way. Lavinia froze on the stairs, Margaret beside her. Below, they could see Arthur facing Constance in the entrance hall, servants hovering uncertainly in doorways, Mr. Graves standing rigid with shock. She's a servant, Arthur, Constance hissed. Marrying her would destroy your standing, your family name. My family name? Arthur's laugh was harsh. My family name comes from ancestors who took what they wanted, society be damned. Men who fought for their beliefs, who married for love despite opposition. He straightened, and Lavinia saw the aristocrat emerge. Not the cold, distant Marquess, but a man of power and conviction. If they could be brave enough to forge their own path, then so can I. You're not seriously considering— I'm not considering anything, Arthur said, his voice dropping to something quieter, but infinitely more forceful. I'm deciding, right now. He turned and looked up the staircase, his eyes finding Lavinia immediately. The raw emotion in his gaze made her breath catch, hope and fear and determination all tangled together. Miss Hartley, he said, his voice carrying through the silent house. Lavinia, would you come down here, please? Her legs felt weak, but Margaret gave her a gentle push. Go on, child. Lavinia descended slowly, aware of every eye on her, servants peeking from doorways, Constance's furious stare, Mr. Graves's shocked expression. But mostly she was aware of Arthur, watching her with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, he took her hand. His touch was warm, steady, and she realized his hands were shaking as badly as hers. I need to say something, Arthur began, his eyes never leaving hers. And I need witnesses, apparently, since my actions seem to concern everyone in this household. Arthur, don't be ridiculous, Constance started. Be quiet, Constance. He said it mildly, but with absolute authority. Then, to Lavinia, I've spent 3 years convinced that feeling nothing was safer than risking pain. I built walls around my heart, kept everyone at a distance, and called it strength. His voice roughened with emotion. It wasn't strength, it was cowardice. My lord, let me finish, please. His grip on her hand tightened. You came here to care for my mother, but without even trying, you did something far more extraordinary. You reminded me what it feels like to be alive, to laugh, to hope, to want something more than just existing through each day. Lavinia felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Around them, the servants had emerged fully from doorways, drawn by the unprecedented scene. You are the most honorable person I have ever met, Arthur continued, his voice strengthening. You're intelligent, compassionate, brave, and kind. You see people, truly see them, in a way that has nothing to do with their titles or wealth. He paused, seeming to gather courage. And I love you, desperately, completely, impossibly, I love you. Gasps echoed through the hall. Constance made a strangled sound. Margaret, from the top of the stairs, was beaming through tears. I know I have no right to ask, Arthur said softly, just for her. I've been cold and dismissive. I was sending you away because I was afraid of what society would say, afraid of losing someone again, afraid of my own feelings. But I realized something. He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with reverent tenderness. I'm more afraid of a life without you in it than I am of anything society might say. Arthur, Lavinia whispered, his name a prayer on her lips. I'm asking you to stay, not as my mother's nurse, but as the woman I intend to court, to cherish, and, if you'll have me, to marry. His gray eyes searched hers. I know it won't be easy. Society will talk. Some people will never accept it. But I don't care. I want you, Lavinia Hartley. Only you. The entrance hall was utterly silent. Lavinia was aware of a dozen witnesses, of Constance's fury, of the magnitude of what Arthur was offering, and what accepting would mean. She thought of being invisible all her life, of being dismissed, overlooked, reduced to her function. She thought of the loneliness that had been her constant companion since her parents died. And she thought of Arthur, broken and grieving, slowly learning to live again. She thought of Margaret's fierce encouragement. She thought of the way her heart felt full for the first time in years whenever she was in this house, with these people. I love you too, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I tried not to. I knew it was impossible. But I fell in love with you anyway, with your pain and your strength, with the way you love your mother, with the man you're becoming as you learn to live again. Arthur's face transformed, joy breaking through like sunlight through clouds. But, Lavinia continued, holding up a hand, I need to know you understand what you're offering. I come with nothing, no family, no dowry, no connections. People will say I trapped you, that I manipulated you. They'll call me a fortune hunter and worse. Are you truly prepared for that? Let them talk, Arthur said fiercely. Anyone who knows you will see the truth, and anyone who doesn't isn't worth my concern. He cupped her face gently with his free hand. You said you come with nothing. You're wrong. You come with everything that matters. Your heart, your spirit, your extraordinary self. That's worth more than all the aristocratic connections in England. Well, I never, Constance sputtered, but no one was paying attention to her anymore. Then yes, Lavinia said, laughing through tears. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll let you court me. Yes to all of it. Arthur swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet as he kissed her. It was utterly scandalous, witnessed by the entire household staff, and Lavinia didn't care. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back, tasting salt from tears. His or hers, she couldn't tell. When they finally broke apart, applause erupted from the servants. Mrs. Davies was dabbing her eyes with her apron. Even Mr. Graves had the ghost of a smile on his austere face. This is outrageous, Constance shrieked. I won't stand here and watch this farce. Arthur, you'll regret this. The scandal will be worth it, Arthur said, not even looking at her. His eyes remained locked on Lavinia. Goodbye, Constance. I trust you can see yourself out. Constance gathered her skirts with furious dignity and swept toward the door. You're making the biggest mistake of your life. No, Arthur said, finally glancing at her. The biggest mistake of my life was wasting 3 years afraid to live. I won't make that error again. As Constance's carriage pulled away, Margaret descended the stairs with remarkable speed for someone supposedly ill. She embraced Lavinia fiercely. Welcome to the family, child, she whispered. Thank you for saving my son. I think he saved himself, Lavinia said. Nonsense. You saved each other. That's how the best love stories work. Mr. Graves approached, clearing his throat. Miss Hartley, I must apologize for my earlier conduct. I failed to see your quality. That was inexcusable. We all see what we expect to see, Mr. Graves, Lavinia said gently. I don't hold it against you. The butler bowed, genuinely respectful this time, and turned to Arthur. Shall I prepare the guest wing for Miss Hartley, my lord? It would be more appropriate than the servants' quarters, given the circumstances. An excellent suggestion. The blue room, I think. And Mrs. Davies, please see that Miss Hartley has everything she requires. It will be my pleasure, my lord, the housekeeper said, smiling at Lavinia with genuine warmth. As the household dispersed, buzzing with excitement, Arthur drew Lavinia into the library. Finally alone, he pulled her close again, resting his forehead against hers. I can't quite believe you said yes, he murmured. I can't quite believe you asked. In front of everyone. I wanted no doubt, no room for misunderstanding. I wanted everyone to know that you're not my secret, not something I'm ashamed of. You're my choice, openly and proudly. Lavinia's heart swelled until she thought it might burst. I love you, Arthur Blackwood. And I love you, Lavinia Hartley. Soon to be Lavinia Blackwood, if I have any say in it. Soon? She raised an eyebrow, teasing. You only just declared yourself. I've wasted enough time already. He kissed her softly. Besides, my mother's health is much improved, but I'd like her well enough to dance at our wedding. Then we'll have to make sure she's strong enough. Lavinia smiled. Lucky for you, I'm an excellent nurse. The very best, Arthur agreed, though I must admit, your nursing skills weren't what made me fall in love with you. No, what was it then? He tucked a strand of her dark hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely tender. The way you see people as they truly are. The way you refused to be invisible even when everyone tried to make you so. Your strength, your compassion, your terrible taste in Gothic novels. They're not terrible. They're absolutely terrible, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life arguing with you about them. He kissed her again, deeper this time, and Lavinia felt the last of her doubts melt away. She had come to Ashbourne Manor expecting nothing more than employment. She'd found a home, a family, and a love she'd never dared imagine possible. Sometimes, she thought as Arthur held her close, the best stories aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that find us when we're brave enough to stay. Epilogue. 6 months later, spring had transformed Ashbourne Manor. Flowers bloomed in wild profusion through the gardens. Windows stood open to sweet breezes, and laughter echoed through halls that had been silent for far too long. Lavinia, now Lady Ashbourne, though she still hadn't quite grown used to the title, sat in Margaret's sunny chamber, reading aloud from yet another Gothic novel. The ghostly figure approached, its hollow eyes fixed upon her trembling form. She intoned dramatically. "Oh, for heaven's sake," Arthur said from the doorway. "Are we still reading this drivel?" "It's not drivel," Lavinia and Margaret said, in unison, then laughed. Arthur crossed to his wife, dropping a kiss on her head. "How is my favorite patient today?" "I'm perfectly well, and you know it," Margaret said, "thanks to your wife's continued tyranny over my diet and exercise regimen." "Medical care, not tyranny," Lavinia corrected. "There's a difference?" "Barely," Arthur agreed, earning himself a swat from his wife. He settled into the chair beside Lavinia, taking her hand naturally, as he always did now. The scandal of their marriage had indeed caused talk, for approximately 3 weeks. Then the Prince of Wales had done something outrageous at a garden party, and society's attention had moved on, as it always did. A few high sticklers had snubbed them. Lavinia had been hurt at first, but Arthur had been right. Anyone worth knowing had judged them on their character, not on society's arbitrary rules. They'd gained far more friends than they'd lost. "I received a letter from the hospital today," Lavinia said. "They've asked if I'd be willing to train other nurses in modern patient care techniques." "Will you do it?" Arthur asked, though his smile suggested he already knew her answer. "I'd like to, if you don't mind. 1 afternoon a week, perhaps?" "My darling, you can do whatever makes you happy. Though I must confess I'm selfishly glad you married me instead of dedicating yourself entirely to nursing." "I didn't marry you instead of nursing," Lavinia said, linking her fingers through his. "I married you, and get to do both. That's rather the point of a true partnership, isn't it?" Margaret made a contented sound. "I remember telling Arthur that women like you come along once in a lifetime. I'm so glad my stubborn son was wise enough to recognize that." "I'm still working on the wise part," Arthur admitted, "but I'm learning." "You were terribly rude when we first met," Lavinia teased. "I was terribly frightened, if we're being honest. One look at you, and some part of me knew you were going to change everything." He brought her hand to his lips. "I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to stay, even when I was too much of a coward to ask. Properly. You asked in front of the entire household staff. I'd hardly call that cowardly. Only after nearly ruining everything by sending you away." "Yes, that was rather stupid of you," Margaret interjected cheerfully. "Thank you, Mother. Your support is overwhelming. Just keeping you humble, darling." They settled into comfortable conversation, the 3 of them, as afternoon light slanted through the windows, and the scent of roses drifted in on the breeze. Later, there would be dinner, and the letters Arthur needed to review, and perhaps a walk through the gardens before bed. But for now, there was this. Simple contentment, the extraordinary gift of ordinary moments, the profound joy of being seen and loved exactly as you are. Lavinia caught Arthur watching her with that expression he got sometimes, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real, as if he was afraid he might wake up and find her gone. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "Promise?" "Promise. You're rather stuck with me now, Lord Ashbourne." "Good," he murmured, leaning over to kiss her temple. "That's exactly how I want it." Margaret cleared her throat pointedly. "If you two are quite finished being disgustingly happy, perhaps Lavinia could continue the story? I need to know if the heroine escapes the ghost, or if she ends up haunting the castle herself." "She escapes," Arthur said. "They always do in these ridiculous novels." "Don't spoil it," both women protested. He laughed, that full, genuine laugh that Lavinia loved, so different from the cold, closed-off man she'd first met. She opened the book again, found her place, and continued reading. Outside, spring continued its eternal work of renewal. Inside, in a room filled with sunlight and love, three people who had found each other against all odds settled into their story. And as all the best love stories do, theirs had a simple, perfect ending. She came to heal and stayed to love. And they lived, quite imperfectly and wonderfully, happily ever after.